This is Duke University.
We are delighted to have you with us. The first time at Duke, but not the last, definitely.
I hope so. I'm very delighted to be here. I did not prepare any formal talk for today because you're supposed to have done some reading and you're supposed to have some questions, and I'm supposed to answer those questions or elaborate on the topics that might rise from the reading or from your questions. And feel free to ask about things that come from outside of these two lectures or two articles that I have sent. I have actually PowerPoint presentations that relate to both of these, but that would take a humongous amount of time if you wanted to go through them. But so I prefer that we will do perhaps actually, I mean, you raise issues and I'll elaborate on them. In case there is need for images, I can go to the images. But these are, I mean, this would have been formal lectures about the two topics. And those are prior to the publications that you have read. So I usually start by developing something as a lecture, and then I give it a second time after the feedback of the first time, and then I would develop it into an article. And this is how you read these two articles. Both of them have been presented as lectures twice before. That's...
So I wonder if I can start with a more general question, because this conversation today is, and the talk this evening, is part of a series that Erdal Gökner and I have been working on for over a year. So it's on global cities, rethinking global cities. And so you're talking about Cairo, and then this afternoon, you'll be talking about wannabe global cities in the Gulf. Now, we had this conference. Barak was there. I think it was about a month ago. And the discussion was about not only global cities, but the global cities discourse. Mm-hmm. And we had Nazar Sayed who came and who talked about Tahrir, and talked about how disenchanted he was with global cities discourse. And I think by the end of the conference, we realized that everybody was disenchanted with the idea of global cities, except for our scholars from Vienna, who were very much into global cities and, you know, the great and glorious past of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit, as people are thinking about their questions, talk to us a little bit about Cairo as a global city across time. Mm-hmm.
I don't know what Nizar was disenchanted with. I am also Nizar and I go long, very, very way back, actually. I sort of arrived at MIT at a time in which he was coming back from Saudi Arabia, where he was working as an architect, en route to Berkeley, where he was to prepare his PhD, and I was actually to start my PhD at MIT. And the roles should have been reversed because I was coming from California to MIT. And he had done his master's at MIT a couple of years before. And this is when we first met. This must have been August or September of 1984. And we have done so many things together. We have co-edited a book on Cairo called Making Cairo Medieval. We have organized, I mean, I've spoken in few of his events. He spoke at MIT twice, I think. And then we've organized a PhD workshop in your counterpart in Honolulu. You know that Doris Duke has a center in Honolulu called Shangri-La, so we organized a PhD workshop there 2 years ago, and we took 7 students from MIT and 7 students from Berkeley for a debate and presentation of their work, and it was an extremely successful event. So after that, Nizar and I don't see eye to eye on so many issues. So I mean, having said that, we are very close, but I mean, I probably would agree with everyone that would come out and say, global city, what is global city? But I would actually put on the table for all of you to start thinking about global. Does it mean that it's centerless, or Does it mean that we are actually thinking of a multi-centered world in which there are powerful cities that control a network of cities around them? And if so, how does this happen? And how do cities actually compete to be in those positions? And Cairo is actually an interesting example to look at, simply because today I would not qualify Cairo as a global city under any of the current definitions, economic, political, geopolitical, or any of that stuff. And some of it might be deliberate. As a matter of fact, the regime that was removed by the revolution of 2011 was clearly not interested in being a center of anything. If you look at the modern history of Cairo under Hosni Mubarak, or of Egypt in general, you will find that there was a reluctance to play a central role in any of the issues that Cairo or Egypt found themselves at the center of, whether it is Arab, African, Islamic, whatever. I mean, Cairo sort of like shed all of this. And since my father-in-law was actually a member of the free officer movement, so I have some sort of an insider knowledge of the free officer movement. And there was clearly on the mind of Abdel Nasser and the people around him, there was clearly a desire to play a major central role, not in the Islamic world, but in the two other spheres of influence of Egypt, and that is the Arab world, which he came to a bit late, and Africa. I mean, Africa was really big on his mind, which is quite unknown in a sense, that he cared so much about it from, of course, the perspective of an authoritarian ruler of the 1960s and 1970s who uses the liberation discourse and independence discourse as a means of actually advancing his own leadership. But that is not the case in Egypt in 1980s, 90s, and the early 2000s. Sisi might be actually rethinking that position if what we read about now in terms of his accord about the Nile Basin. And I don't know if Nizar told you that he's writing a book on the Nile. This is what Nizar is doing now. Yeah. But Cairo, the historical Cairo, is actually a cosmopolitan city in the real sense of the word. And that's what's interesting about studying the history of Cairo prior to the Ottoman period. And the two, or actually the three, I should say, three moments in the history of Cairo that show that aspiration to play a regional, if not sort of like a larger cultural role, are the Fatimid, the Ayyubid, and the Mamluk moments. And each actually comes with a different approach to what Cairo is and what Cairo ought to be. The Fatimid, as we all know, there is a caliphal aspiration in there. And there is a very strong religious discourse, and Cairo becomes the center of da'wah. And we don't know much about it. Nowadays, the Ismaili Institute and other Ismaili-funded institutions of learning are trying to publish enough material to somehow sort of like enlighten us on the movement of da'wah and the network and where were they and how far they reached. And the fact of the matter is that from the little indices that we have now, I mean, it was just unbelievable, the outreach of the da'wah from Cairo and going all the way to one end South Asia and the other end sort of like South Europe. I mean, we have informations about da'is that were in Palermo, da'is that were in Zaragoza in Spain and on. Second moment is the counter-crusade and the Ayyubid role in that. And it's not Salah ad-Din, because Salah ad-Din here, of course, my Damascus centricity would come to the forefront. So, of course, actually, Salah ad-Din is someone that built his own glory around Damascus, even though Cairo was his original capital and a place that allowed him to sort of like move against his master in Damascus. But it's really Al-Kamil that is the interesting figure in the sense of creating a some sort of a cosmopolitan center in Cairo. And here I would like to bring in a story that I don't know how many of you know it, and it's not really verifiable anymore, but it's an interesting story. We all know, you all probably know Frederick II, the ruler of the late Norman Empire that was initially in Palermo after they have taken southern Italy, and then they moved up to eastern Italy, but they had their base in what is today Austria, actually, originally, the family. And Frederick II is supposed to have been an Arabophile. He's supposed to have learned Arabic. He's supposed to have been interested in Arabic culture. But the most important thing about him is, in history at least, is his fight with the Pope. He was trying to assert that the emperor is a much more important player in the international affairs game than the Pope. He was excommunicated at some point, and he moved his capital from different cities, mostly in southern Italy, and then he came to Jerusalem. And he worked out a deal with Al-Kamil that they would let the Crusades extend their authority again over Jerusalem, and Al-Kamil was extremely realistic. He realized that he's not going to be able to defend Jerusalem. And the relationship between the two was not cordial, but what was at least open, and there was some sort of an exchange. So at one point, the story goes, Frederick II sent Al-Kamil 3 geometric riddles on a piece of paper. And he said, you keep on saying that your people are more scientifically oriented than our people. No geometrician in my empire was able to solve these riddles. Can you find someone in your empire to solve these riddles? So Al-Kamil supposedly sent them out. Now, the most interesting thing is that where is out? Where were these sent in order to imagine that here you are in the citadel of Cairo, and you want to find in your empire or in a domain that you feel that you have some sort of an authority over, people who could actually respond to that challenge. So it was sent out to faraway places, as the most important person was Ibn Yunus, a mathematician in Mosul, to whom he sent immediately this. Mosul was not under his authority, but was under his suzerainty. The ruler in Mosul was a descendant of the Zingid, but still sort of like paying allegiance to the Sultan back in Cairo, to Al-Kamil. It was sent to cities in central Turkey today, where they were looking for mathematicians, places like Aksaray, for example. And it was sent to all the Syrian cities. And then they found a geometrician who is from Ashmunin, a city that no longer exists in Egypt, was actually a major center in Egypt before Islam, a late pharaonic type of city, had its own temples and supposedly was a center of knowledge. This guy was born there, but he had traveled all around, and he had studied with Ibn Yunus in Mosul. And by the time he got these riddles to solve, he was working for the cousin of Al-Kamil as an architect, rebuilding the bastions and the fortifications of the city of Hama in Syria. And he solved them. And he sent them back to the emperor, and I mean to the Sultan, and the Sultan sent them to the emperor in Jerusalem with the message that our people are better than yours. This person deserves actually more writing than he had received. There is not much information about him except for what I have told you, and except that what he had composed, and that he was also a designer. So he wasn't only a geometrician of sorts, but he also wrote actually on theological issues, which is what you have to do in order to make a name in the medieval period. His sobriquet is Ta'asif, which actually no one knows where it comes from and what it means. I don't remember his actual name, but I mean, he had, and then Al-Ashmuni at the end of it, because he's from Ashmun. But Ta'asif is the name that he came down to us in history with. To me, this is a sign of the globalization of the period that we're talking about. This is, in a sense, actually, what is globalization in the 12th century? It's the possibility of someone in a center like Cairo to actually draw on the skills and the resources of so many cities around and be able to gather these resources for a cause that serves his own agenda. And I have to remind you that Al-Kamil was not really the ruler of these cities that he was sent in missives to. He was sort of like a powerful ruler among many of the Ayyubid family who were independent in the cities that they were ruling. We come to the third moment in the history of Cairo, where Cairo really becomes a serious global city, and that is the Mamluk period. And here, perhaps, we can start speaking about the reading that you have, because it's not very clear that the Mamluks aspired to be a center. There is nothing in the action of the Mamluks that shows that they really, with the exception of Zahir Baybars, and we can speak about him separately, but with the exception of Zahir Baybars, the Mamluks seem to have been content with the boundaries of the empire as it has been set by Zahir Baybars. So despite the fact that we are at an age in which we have, it's framed between Genghis Khan on one end and Timur on the other end, and here we have world empires that are being formed, and the Mamluks were supposedly the most formidable army of their own time. They actually refrained from taking over places like Libya or Sudan. I mean, they sent punitive campaigns against the Nubians in southern Egypt, which today is part of Egypt, but then at the time it was not. But that's about all they have done. And then Zahir Baybars made a foray into Turkey, into the Turkey of today. It was in Turkey, of course, at the time. And it was a disaster because Central Anatolia paid a heavy price for the fact that he managed to hold Central Anatolia for a couple of years. Ghazan, the Ilkhanid ruler of Tabriz, came down with a vengeance on these cities. And there is the famous vizier, Turkish, Persian, I mean not Turkish actually, Persian vizier, Pirvane is his title. I don't know how many of you have come across him. He was put to death in an extremely painful way by Ghazan because he was accused of having collaborated with Zahir Baybars, who was trying to expand the boundaries of the Mamluk Empire into the land that was being taken over by other Turkic tribes, sort of like post-Seljuk tribes in what ultimately will become Turkey. So the Mamluks did not want to build, in my opinion, did not actually aspire to build a territorial empire larger than what they have. Salah ad-Din, on the other hand, did. We know that Salah ad-Din wanted, and there are recorded discourses of Salah ad-Din saying that he wanted to go and take over Iran and even India. So the idea of building an empire, which is probably the most important motor of actions of rulers in antiquity before the modern colonial age, and here I suggest that you read Jean-Claude Garcin's distinction between the pre-modern and the modern age in terms of empire building, because he emphasizes one point that is superb for those of us who work on Mamluk or actually on other medieval period, is that the shift that happened, it's always about trade, of course, and it's always about controlling trade routes, but the shift that happened is from trade in people to trade in goods, and that the Muslims never managed to actually accomplish that shift. The Muslims in here are the Mamluks, of course, and they started retreating immediately after the Black Death of 1348-49. What makes the Mamluk moment so important, and this is where architecture comes in, is that the Mamluks built the largest amount of monuments any dynasty in history anywhere has built. There's no one, no dynasty in history that beats the Mamluks. And that's unusual when you think about it. The resources of the empire are limited to Syria and Egypt and a little bit of what is today Turkey. So we're not talking about a Mongol empire that controls China and Central Asia and Persia, and therefore the resources are amazing. Here we are actually dealing with a rather small empire when you think about it. The late Michael Meineke counted 2,700 monuments built in Cairo between the year 1250 and 1517. That's about 100 monuments a year. I want you to imagine, I mean, those of you who have been to Dubai and the proud assertion of the Dubaians that it's a city that has 1/4 of all cranes in the world in action at any one moment. Cairo probably had like half of the medieval cranes at the time at work. And what are these buildings when you start looking at the list? I would say about half of them were madrasas. And that's the important point. It means that Cairo actually was, for reasons that I will come to if you ask me, but I'm not going to raise them myself. Cairo was building centers of learning for a world that is much larger than its own domain. And that's the point about their globalization, if you think. I mean, the way the US and to a lesser extent England in the 20th century has functioned as a magnet for education kids from all over the world would come. I would say Cairo was that in the period between 1270 and potentially into the 1480. So 200 solid years of Cairo being the center of learning in the Islamic world. And it was exactly like it is today. You have to go to a Harvard, an Oxford, a Yale, an MIT, a God knows what, to get to garner that reputation of sort of like a great person in your field. It was actually the same then. And if you go through the name roles of people who studied or who ultimately, which is exactly what happens. I mean, as an example, instead of going back to Syria, you find yourself a job where you actually got your PhD from. So people who studied in Al-Zahiriya, who came from Ghur, that's actually eastern Afghanistan, and ended up being professors at Al-Zahiriya in Cairo, are the examples that I'm interested in. If you have people who would come from India, from the farthest points in Central Asia, from all of Islamic Africa, and I'm speaking here about sub-Saharan Islamic Africa, not about North Africa only. So we have people who are Shanqiti, who end up being professors in schools or in madrasas in Cairo in the 1400s. That is people from Timbuktu. This is what Shanqiti would mean. People who got their earlier education in Mali today. So to me, that's Cairo as a global city. And Abdel Nasser aspired to do that. And I think actually, despite the fact, I mean, I'm named Nasser, of course, after Abdel Nasser. So, and I was born when he nationalized the Suez Canal. Both my mom and dad were Arab nationalists, so it was very appropriate. After the infisal, the secession between Syria and Egypt, and I was 3 years old, they would have loved to change my name, but it was too late.
Actually, if you don't mind saying who you are so that Nasser knows who you're
My name is Abdul Sattar Jawad. I teach comparative literature and Middle East studies in Arabic. You actually refreshed our memory of this wonderful city. And I remember in the 1970s, the Cairean people are proud of having a capital where the East and West meet together in there. Sharqi Gharbi, they say. And I enjoyed going in the evening to Sheraton, to Al Jazeera and the Nile, listen to a lady singer in the evening. She sings in 3 languages, English, French, and Arabic. And I pay just 2 guineas with free Stella, free beer also, just 2. And there was...
It still is my favorite beer.
There were also Cairean coffee houses, Abedin, Makharish, and a Grupi, which was a Greek coffee houses run by a Greek, you see. I wonder what happened to that culture, that tradition in the face of building new buildings, faceless concrete. Where is the ancient Cairo nowadays, and the modernity is a clash of businesses? And I appreciate your talk, and we love Misr Ummina. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Where is Cairo today? But actually, it's not just Cairo. I mean, where is the whole city culture that you're talking about? And it seems to me that here we do get into a much wider question that perhaps a lot of us are not prepared to discuss, which is the social changes that happened globally. We're not talking only about Egypt. Of course, actually, one can analyze the particular conditions in Egypt, but there is no denying that culture and cultural production had more currency. If you were a cultural producer, you were more respected in the middle of the 20th century than you are in the late of the 20th century or the early 21st century. So it's not a heroic age. It's not that the intellectuals at the time were much more, I don't know, sort of like committed or learned or involved or engaged than intellectuals would be today, but the intellectual of today is an embattled creature. The intellectual of today is actually very low on the pecking order of the world. There are other types of individuals that have taken up the leadership in the shaping of the image of the nation, if nation still is a category that anyone is interested in, but in the shaping of the image of the society, in leading the society. So that moment, which is exemplified by none other than Jean-Paul Sartre, the idea of actually the intellectual as a shaper of public opinion, is no longer valid. I mean, what intellectual is a shaper of public opinion? Here in the US, we had a chance of having someone like Edward Said being that, but I mean, for all intents and purposes, Edward Said couldn't publish an article in the New York Times. So I think actually what you are putting your finger on is actually an international or a global malaise, and that is we are a dying breed, and therefore we are making all these agonizing sounds as we are dying. And we are actually not doing well. That is, we are not fighting the battle well to preserve our privileges. We have to admit that this is privilege. And here, I mean, I'm referring really to a very Marxist-based kind of struggle. There is no sophistication in my argument beyond class distinction. Yeah. And we are a class that has lost its privileges. And it's lost its privileges not because we are less intellectually oriented than we used to be, but because we are less economically solid than we used to be, because we used to be more compensated because of patronage systems, because of a certain moment in human history in which intellectual activities were more appropriate or more respected or something of that sort. The moments in which you had the building of all the great universities in America, the moments in which you had intellectuals in France that could actually kill a government, all of that is gone. The moments in which you had all of these cafes in which intellectuals in the third world countries fomented liberation movements, it's all gone. I mean, at this point in time, you still go to cafes. I mean, Café Riche is there, by the way. It opens at the whims of the owner. The owner sits there. He's always inside. And then sometimes he will open it, sometimes he won't. The biggest battle a couple of years ago was whether they are allowed to serve beer or not. And this is before the revolution even. And this was a battle that it was a pitched battle. I mean, a lot of us took sides in it. So you can imagine how small we have become. Yeah. There is still Maqha al-Hurriya, I don't know if you know it, in Bab al-Luq, where you can still get your Stellas for £2 today. So there is still a place where younger intellectuals, but the funny thing is that Maqha al-Hurriya takes in more non-Egyptians than Egyptians. And they all are coming after that image. You have all of these globetrotters, mostly European and American kids, who have read 1001 Night, were fascinated with the Arab world. They come to Cairo.
He teaches 1001 Night.
Yeah. I mean, probably some of his students made it there and sat in Maqha al-Hurriya sipping Stellas and remembering the good old days. And there was Zahrat al-Bustan. Did you know Zahrat al-Bustan?
Yeah.
Zahrat al-Bustan was actually the more the more popular, if you want, or the more Marxist, in a sense, place where you get stuff cheaper than Riche. Riche has become so famous for its own good that intellectuals no longer could afford it.
We used to see Najib Mahfouz. And
Of course. I came in late, so I actually met with Najib Mahfouz few times because my patron at the time was Gamal Ghitani. And so I used to go to the meetings, but they were on a boat by that time. It's no longer it was on a boat in the Nile. It was actually literally Sarsara Fawq al-Nil, and I can tell you privately about the kind of Sarsara that was taking place.
But what do you mean by patron? I mean, in terms of... Go ahead, Mona.
Ellen, I thought you had your hand.
No, she needs to go.
Okay, Mona, and then Ellen, other hand, Burak.
Ellen is generous because unfortunately I have to go teach soon. I wonder if I can bring us back into the article that we read for today about Mamluk Cairo. And it was just really exquisite the way I felt that you were looking at the emirs manipulated the small spacage and the frontages that they had for maximum. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the connections between Darb al-Ahmar and Ashara al-Azam, which was reserved for for more royal frontages, or the sultanic, and in terms of them both being connected as a procession route, and in terms of, do we see the similar usage of space in a Shara al-Azam, or, I mean, how would you compare the two? How are they connected?
I mean, this article started as a book project about 20-something years ago. I was at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton the year before my tenure review, and it started as a book project that ultimately I'm starting to take out parts of it. I'm scavenging, actually, a book that will never get published, so this is one of the articles. But I am interested in Mamluk Cairo still, and hopefully I will go back to it, despite the fact that there had been 2 recent books on Mamluk Cairo by 2 very dear friends, but I would say that they are both unsatisfactory. It seems to me that we still are far from understanding the greatness of that moment. It's not the greatness of the Mamluks, and here perhaps you are pushing me in order to start revealing the elements that I think factored in the greatness of Cairo at the time, which are not really glorious as far as the Mamluks are concerned. It's a way of hoarding the wealth. I mean, building Cairo was actually a way of avoiding having to return the money to the states, basically. That's the reason why Cairo acquired its 2,700 monuments. But if it is true that emirs were not allowed to build in the Shari al-Azam, which we don't know. I mean, this is a conjecture by looking at the buildings that are there. Then the difference is very clear. The monuments on the Shari al-Azam, first of all, were trying to eradicate, so the first 4 of them are trying to eradicate the traces of the Fatimid. And therefore, we had at least 2 PhD dissertations that I'm familiar with that tried to reconstruct Shari al-Azam in the Fatimid period and failed. So thorough was the Ayyubid first, but the Mamluks second, erasure of all traces of the Fatimids. It is amazing, actually, that when you think of Egypt in, I don't know, 1988, and as far as I know, there is not a single native Egyptian who is Shiite. Native, huh? The wife of Abdel Nasser is Shiite, but because Papa is Iranian. How come? I mean, they were ruled for 250 years by a Shiite dynasty. Where did the Shia go? So thorough was the erasure by the Ayyubid and then ultimately the Mamluks, who were staunch Sunnis, exactly like the Ottomans later. It seems to me that there is something sort of like in here, the 2 Turkish men might jump at me, that makes the Turks sort of like staunch Sunnis. I mean, every time that you have a staunch Sunni action, there's a Turkic person behind it. Yeah, but but Salahuddin was Kurdish, but that's totally irrelevant. He was Turkic in culture. He had nothing of Kurdish in him. This is a guy who, not only him, he and his uncle and his father grew up in a Turkic court. Being Kurdish is simply basically a hazard of the profession, because you could have been Georgian, you could have been Armenian, you could have been any of those little communities that were absorbed by the invading Seljuk and made active players in the empire. So I actually would never say that there is a Kurdish culture, even though he appointed, I don't know if you know that, but the chief judge in Egypt under Salahuddin was a Hakkari, which means that he was a Kurd. And he actually promoted few Kurdish sheikhs to different positions during his rule. So he still has that. But it's very similar to when we have someone like Sultan Lajin al-Mansuri, who ruled for 2 years and who is reputed to have been from Dunkirk, today in Poland, German city, German origin. That is, you have a Mamluk who's a German and who apparently favored fair-haired Mamluks on the assumption that they are like him from a European background or a Slavic background or a Germanic background. So that sort of like that ethnic favoritism still does not change the quality that I'm trying to ascribe to the Ayyubid, in my opinion at least. So there is that difference, is that there is a role of the buildings that the sultans are building on Shari al-Azam, which is they try to eradicate traces of Fatimids, which means they want to occupy as much space as possible. So if you look at the facade of the Madrasa of Salih Najmuddin Ayyub, the first major monuments on the Shari al-Azam, actually Al-Kamil Madrasa is perhaps earlier, but we don't know much about its facade. It stretches for like 200 meters of a building that does not require that much facade, but it's trying to eliminate whatever Fatimid facade existed before. The same applies to Qalawun. We don't have Zahir Baybars Madrasa anymore to be able to say how much, but if we agree that it was the width of the street that was open, which is called Shari al-Qadi today, and then the remains of the madrasa, we are talking about, again, another 100 meters of a facade. Now, when you look at the Mamluk emirs madrasas or other buildings, we're talking about 10, 15, 20-meter facades on Darb al-Ahmar. So it's like less than 1/3 of space on the street that they have had. And this is why they were competing, and this is where the article comes from. Whereas the sultans were actually, after replacing the identity of the street altogether. And the street was not really a residential street. It had very little residences. We know that Barqouq, for example, erased the one, who was speaking about modern living, something, and I thought I wanted to interrupt. I forgot now who was speaking about it. But you know that Cairo, I mean, Cairo was the first city to have residential tenement houses in history. And that's the type that is called Rabbat. So there is a Rabbat that used to exist in the place of Barqouq's madrasa today, which immediately indicate, of course, that the Waqfs have expanded along the street, even though that was the Sultanian street. Darb al-Ahmar, on the other hand, we have absolutely no sultan that built anything on Darb al-Ahmar. So clearly they didn't want to do it. And Darb al-Ahmar, we have to remember, developed slowly, because Darb al-Ahmar started from the northern part near Bab Zuwayla, and there was no Darb al-Ahmar that continued, even though the citadel was built fairly early on. But it was a spine that hasn't acquired its meat yet, and the meat came over the period of 150 years of development. So the difference is very clear. Sultans had full freedom to appropriate as much facade as they want. Emirs had to deal with the plot that is available to them.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your both the readings and your presentation. My name's Ellen McClarney, and I'm teaching a class actually on Egypt, and some of my students are here. And so my question:
You're teaching a class on what? I'm sorry.
Oh, on Egypt. It's
okay.
It's on, the whole class is on Egypt. So I kind of have two questions. Like, one's more about the medieval period, and the other one is about that legacy in the modern. And from the reading about the Mamluk architecture, your conclusion at the end was that the architecture helps sort of propagate these hierarchies, or it said a lot about the hierarchies they're trying to establish. But as I was reading the article, I was thinking, you kept on talking about these transitional spaces between the street and, you know, the buildings that were being built, and like sort of this sense of like integrating, you know, the street and these like more formal institutions. So as I was reading it, I was seeing more of like the Mamluks kind of trying to legitimize their presence amongst the people. But your conclusion at the end was more of like maintaining hierarchies of the rulers over the ruled, and you sort of talked about that in the structures of the architectural structures, that, you know, the service things like the kutab and the sabil were in the back, or they were hidden from sight, right? Mm-hmm. So I was just wondering if you could comment on that. But also, one thing, you know, the students we read about at the beginning of the class was like Muhammad Ali's like architectural projects, and then how Muhammad Ali like can you comment a little bit about how he tried to do battle? Did he try to do battle with Mamluk architecture? Because he sort of imported these more like, you know, some like European type features into like Islamic architecture, right? And so, yeah, I was wondering if you could comment on the relationship between Muhammad Ali's architectural legacy and that of the Mamluks. Mm-hmm. And then in terms of, so where we're stopped in the class right now is like basically Suez Canal in like 1967, right? So we've been talking a lot about Nasser, And I'm wondering, with that architectural legacy, I mean, does Nasser have like, is Mogama like his architectural legacy, right? Or what's the, I mean, what happens under Mubarak that architectural legacy is lost? And what happens when neoliberalism comes and tries to replace like the legacy of Nasser? I mean, what is left, and what's
Well, Nasser's architectural legacy is there. It's there for everyone to see. And the guy was clearly interested in an architectural legacy. I mean, the article on Tahrir Square makes that point about Nasser trying to balance the kind of message that he's sending out to the world by allowing Hilton to build the hotel at the tip of the square, and sort of like an extremely important point, because this used to be the barracks of the British soldiers. And I'll tell you a little bit of a story aside from that. I mean, I can speak for hours on these subjects that you are asking on, and I can actually send you lots of articles which I didn't send that deal with those issues. But and then you have the building of the Arab League. That's Abdel Nasser's legacy, and the choice of Mahmoud Riyad, the architect that had built it, was deliberate. We want a modernist building in there. Mugamma is actually something that was started under the king, and it was a donation from the Soviet government. So the Soviet government was actually trying to somehow appease the Egyptians, or the Egyptian kingdom at that time. And the architect is actually a Marxist who was trained in Moscow. I think Kemal Shakir is his name or something like that. Not a very well-known architect. But that becomes also part of Abdel Nasser's legacy, because the building was not completed in 1952. So he continued building the building. And you could see in these three buildings, there are three gestures of modern architecture. It is very clear that Abdel Nasser was pushing modern architecture. And when you think that he hired an aristocrat by the name of Sayyid Quraim, who is an architect that hasn't been well studied in Egypt, to design the new neighborhoods that he was planning, namely Madinat Nasser and Muhandisin. And if you look at the plan of Madinat Nasser and Muhandisin, Sayyid Quraim is a graduate of the ETH from Zurich, a bastion of modernism and technology in architecture and planning. And he applied that. The plans are so rigidly modernist and so clearly modernist. And the message is out there for everyone to see. Abdel Nasser is a modernist, and he is firmly believing in the potential of modernity to lift his people up. What probably poisoned it is that he was also firmly believing that he is the only appropriate leader to do that. But otherwise, I mean, I think the principles that he was coming with very naively, I should say, he was not a very educated individual, but extremely intelligent, are sound. I mean, he was doing exactly what Tito and Nehru were doing in their own countries respectively, except that he and Tito shared that desire to stay in power as long as possible. Nehru thought that his daughter could be a better ruler. I mean, all of them are interested in perpetuating the rule of their families anyway, or of their legacy. But the distinction between Muhammad Ali also has an architectural legacy, and his architectural legacy is the citadel. The citadel of Cairo as it stands today is actually Muhammad Ali. I mean, my dissertation was trying to resurrect the Mamluk citadel from underneath the citadel of Muhammad Ali, because in the 48 years that he ruled in Egypt, he actually rebuilt the whole citadel. So his mosque is his legacy. And that, I have an article about that I can share with you, but I can actually show you a little bit more about what kind of legacy we're dealing with, especially that you mentioned European influences. As a matter of fact, there is very little European influences in there. And again, deliberately. The person who coined the term Arab architecture is a French architect by the name of Pascal Coste. He lived in Cairo between 1818 and 1828 or thereabout. Worked as an engineer initially. There was no distinction between engineers and architects, and he was building factories, and he dug the Mahmoudiyya canal that connects Cairo to Alexandria, that connects the Nile to Alexandria. Alexandria was off the Nile course, and therefore wasn't getting sweet water. And this was a canal that preceded the Suez Canal, and it was on the same magnitude, and thousands of Fallahin died actually digging this. The engineer that did it was Pascal Coste, and he was noticed by the ruling class because he had built palaces in Alexandria for the British consul and for few Armenian, Egyptian, wealthy and powerful individuals. So Muhammad Ali asked him to build, you can go and see actually one pavilion that he built still stands there. It's the Shubra Palace, which used to be the agricultural school of the University of Cairo, and now it's a tourist attraction, a beautiful place to go and visit. It's a pavilion around an artificial lake in the middle. It was already built by Ottoman architects, so Pascal Coste just reinforced few of the points. It's not his design. His designs have not been built. Muhammad Ali asked him to build two mosques, one at the citadel of Cairo, one in Alexandria. He wanted to have dynastic mosques in his two capitals. Pascal Coste said, I have never been to a mosque. I had no idea what a mosque is. So Muhammad Ali issued him a firman and sent him with a soldier to visit every mosque he wanted to visit in Cairo and in Egypt at large. And he produced a book called L'architecture arabe ou l'architecture du Caire, dessin mesuré et dessiné entre 1818 et 1826, Pascal Coste. The most elaborate compendium of relevés of mosques and other buildings in Egypt. Huge volume, actually. MIT has one of these original copies. It was published in 1836. Beautiful book. And therefore, he learned a little bit about mosque architecture in Egypt, and he came out with the notion that the most appropriate architecture for Egypt and the one that could create a nationalist architecture in Egypt is the Mamluk style. So he designed two mosques that are somewhat Ottomans, but with heavy Mamluk touches. And then he left in 1828. He later wrote his memoirs, and he called himself an artist because it's called Les Mémoires d'un Artiste, not an architect. And it's an 800-page book because he later on went on an expedition to Iran and produced a similar book on Iranian architecture. And he says in it that I heard that they started digging out the mosque in Cairo. They had canceled the mosque in Alexandria because this happened after the Moria expedition where the Egyptian army was defeated. I mean, the Egyptian and the Ottoman army were defeated in, must have been 1826 or thereabout, during the Greek Independence War. The European powers ganged together against the Ottoman. The Ottoman Sultan sent to Muhammad Ali saying, send me the fleet. And this is when the Egyptians realized that the Ottomans are so weak and it's about time to put his own plan of building his own empire in place. So building the mosque was actually the gesture of reclaiming the greatness of an Islamic empire. Muhammad Ali was an Ottoman pseudo-intellectual through and through, and he wanted to become a full intellectual. The guy was illiterate. He learned Turkish, Persian, and Arabic while he was a ruler of Egypt. If you look at the roster of publications from the Bula publication in the first couple of years after he had established it under Rafa'at Tahtawi, there are translations of books that he had required specifically. And they are the biography of Napoleon, of Ekaterina II, of Bismarck, of Selim I, of Suleiman Qanuni. These are the people that Muhammad Ali was looking up to as model rulers that he wanted to emulate, and he wanted to create his own empire along the same line. So his architecture is actually classical Ottoman deliberately. He wanted to go back to the great moments of the Ottoman because he is no longer interested in the fainéant Ottomans of his time who are doing Baroque. So if you go to the Muhammad Ali Mosque at the Citadel, which is built, by the way, on the footprint of the mosque of Pascal Coste and has absolutely not a single element from Pascal Coste's design. We still don't know who the architects were, but there's one that is identified as Bushnaqi, which means Bosnian, but we have no idea who they are. And after I published that article 25 years ago, an American woman contacted me and said, my grandfather was the architect. He was Greek and sent me his name and his biography. So we have a lot of contenders for who ultimately designed that mosque, but it's not Pascal Coste. And my argument is that Muhammad Ali said, I am reviving the Ottoman Empire, because the mosque was built between 1829 and 1842. And Muhammad Ali sent his expedition against Syria 1832 and lasted until 1840. And in 1839, the Egyptian army was in Kütahya. That's 2 hours from Istanbul. He was about to take over the Ottoman Empire. And if it wasn't for the European powers that ganged again against him, because they preferred to keep the sick man of Europe as opposed to sort of like this little vigorous guy that is rising against us in Egypt. So his architecture is so contextual. He is building with the taste of an Ottoman, but also with the aspiration of a revivalist Ottomanist. That's what his architecture is.
Sort of take over.
You still had more questions, but I don't know if I have the time to answer them.
Maybe we can come back to them, but fascinating discussion. My questions sort of follow up a little bit on Ellen's, so I thought I'd ask next. As a footnote, we would love to, if you have more articles you would like to recommend, we can put them on the website, which is of use to us as the website will continue in the future. And we want to continue this discussion, especially focusing a little bit more around Middle Eastern cities in the coming years. But I wanted to try to segue.
I have many of them on my academia.edu. You can actually download them from there.
Okay, thank you.
But I can send them to you also.
Okay, that would be great. I want to segue into the second article, and there are a couple of themes I wanted to raise and maybe have you comment on. One has to do with the relationship between the city and urban space and the state and state power. And it seems sometimes these are converging and sometimes these are diverging. And I want to introduce the notion of protest, but through the lens of architecture and agency, because you've given a number of examples now of how architecture is replacing what has come before. Something new is emerging on the foundations of what is left. So is that a useful way to think about this? Is the agency of architecture a useful way to think about the relationship between city space and state power? I have a second question, but I thought first I'd start with that one.
Well, I mean, if you're an architect, your answer would be yes. But it seems to me that we have to always qualify it. Because what kind of agency are we talking about? Architecture is such an archaic profession when you think about it that still depends very much on a pre-modern patronage system. Architects, by and large, are service providers, and they basically execute what they are asked to execute. Their protest has been, in many instances, translated into formal gestures in their architecture. But the real protest would be, I refuse to build a prison, for example. But if you are an architect and you get a commission to build a prison and you have no other job to do, and you say that I protested it, or I protested the oppression of the state by building a prison where the prisoners have more sunshine, I think it's an extremely weak way of saying I am protesting. But again, I mean, this is what professionalism is. So architecture as something that is designed by individual has to be modest in its claim of a social role or of agency. But architecture as a way of organizing the space, namely whether it is designed by architects or not, the appropriation of the space is still an architectural gesture. And it need not be something that is designed and executed by or under the supervision of architects, or it could be. But the idea is that space is such a polyvalent entity that you can do whatever you want to do with it. So if you really are aiming to use architecture as a mediator between different political positions, it is possible. But you don't need the architects for that. Or actually, the architects are really their own referent for that possibility. Because at the end of the day, the architects that have built oppressive buildings are much more numerous than those who have refused to build them and paid very heavily sometimes.
So the second part had to do with periodization. It seems you have some really interesting examples of how the early modern is in some ways inflecting or commenting on the present moment or the 19th century moment. When you were going through the three global moments for Cairo, I couldn't help of thinking about what would be the parallel moments for Constantinople, Istanbul, for example, and I just quickly jotted down, a Byzantine, a Seljuk, and an Ottoman, perhaps, moment. But my question came when you said, your periodization sort of ended at 1517, and then I thought about the 15th and the 16th centuries, and a lot of what you described about, Cairo being a sort of a mecca for education, et cetera, had shifted to Istanbul in some respects.
Of course.
And then your example here of Muhammad Ali, I'm just wondering, is there a way to reconceive of those two cities in particular, that is Istanbul and Cairo, and in the way they kind of bookmark not only the Mediterranean space, but this idea of Islamic empire, or the continuation of Islamic empire, and how they're not necessarily always competing necessarily. Your second example kind of put this forward, but there's a larger sort of Sunni mission there going on that we can see reflected in architectural space.
It's very, very difficult to satisfy you actually with my answer in here. It will be very difficult really to do it because I don't see that. I mean, there are two stories that would illustrate the point of how that continuity is not really conceivable. The first is what happened to the last Abbasid caliph in Egypt and the fact that he disappears. So here we have an empire that had built its legitimacy on the fact that they have the puppet caliph in some tower in the citadel of Cairo, but at least it's an Abbasid, and they claim legitimacy by saying that we have this person here. Selim I is much more expedient. He takes the caliph dies in Istanbul, supposedly out of natural causes, and Selim says before he died, he actually passed on the caliphate to me. That's a very different perception of who you are and how you want to build your empire than what the Mamluks have maintained from Zahir Baybars bringing that caliph, the first Abbasid caliph in 1268, whom he rescued supposedly from the Syrian desert. He was just wandering around after the destruction of the caliphate in Baghdad in 1258 and brought to Cairo. And actually the first person he didn't like because he was sort of like trying to assert a caliphal authority, so he sent him as the head of an army to fight the Mongols, knowing that the army is going to be routed, and he sacrificed his own army in order to get rid of the first caliph. And then he resurrected the caliphate with a little bit more malleable member of the Abbasid family. But that's the first moment. The second is actually an architectural moment, a beautiful architectural moment. So Selim I comes inside the city of Cairo, and he is told, this is a wonderful city, you have to look at it. So he goes around, and he stops in front of the Madrasa of Sultan Hassan, a very impressive building, probably one of the most impressive Islamic buildings of any time. And he looks at it and he says, this is a great hisar, a great citadel. Then he goes and he's looking around, and he stops in front of the madrasa of his nemesis, whom he had killed in Marj Dabiq. ISIS now is resurrecting the importance of Dabiq. You know, Dabiq is the name of the ISIS journal today, and that's actually in reference to Marj Dabiq, the battle between the Ottomans and the Mamluks, in which Sultan Qanusul Ghuri lost his life, and his body was never found. And he had built a madrasa in Cairo, which was completed shortly before that fateful moment for him. So when Selim stood in front of it, he looked at it and he said, this is the qa of a merchant. So he actually looked at his predecessor, if you want, in that imaginary imperial lineage as an undeserving emperor, as an undeserving sultan. I think these two moments speak about a rupture rather than at a continuity. And then when you think about when did Cairo start acquiring another good status, which is 18th century, that is 16th, 17th century, there's really hardly anything that you can see happening in Cairo. And that's the golden age of the Ottoman Empire. So it was when the Ottoman Empire weakened that Cairo started moving up, and it was the Mamluks who actually came back. Now, the descendants of the Mamluks. David Ayalon wrote an article in which he tried, I think unsuccessfully, to explain why Selim killed all the Mamluks of Syria and spared the Mamluks of Egypt and somehow appointed them in his administration of Egypt. Because ultimately, 200 years later, despite the fact that he had eliminated the Mamluk system as this sort of like one-class aristocracy that is always replenishing itself by importing new slaves from the Caucasus, he interrupted this, even though there was still a little bit of that trade. But all the great patrons of architecture from about 1740 to the arrival of Napoleon in 1798 are actually Mamluks, not, I mean, the descendants of the Mamluks. And they've shared the rule of the country with the Ottomans. And we have 2 or 3 of them that tried to go independent. So despite the fact that it will be very beautiful to think of these 2 cities as sort of like part of a necklace of imperial capitals that starts from Damascus to Baghdad to Isfahan to Cairo to Istanbul, I don't think so. I think we have to give up on the dream of a great Islamic empire. I don't think it ever existed. It existed only in the sense of the caliphate at an early period. But once you start having different national and ethnic identities coming into the play, we have to take that into account in our assessment of some sort of a pan-Islamic empire.
Morocco has a necklace of imperial cities that are right.
So I just want to say that we probably have about quarter of an hour. So Barak and then Bruce, but I want particularly to know if the students have a question. Go for it. Because we'll make time for it. Okay, so these will be our 3 questions. Barak.
Thank you. Yeah, mine is a methodological question that might give you a chance to talk about both of the essays a little bit. A methodological question that has to do with sort of the spatial turn, and if you want to call it that, and I thought reading through the articles, maybe it's something that you sort of think about or try to balance a little bit between the monument and in one case the square, and in the other the idea of the street, just kind of the procession, the street, and the square, and then also having to, in detail, to talk about the monuments themselves. And I felt like you were doing both in a sense, not really choosing one or the other. And what are your thoughts on that? I mean, in terms of balancing the space with the idea of the monument, and both in terms of the kind of a modern Tahrir Square type of space where the space was supposed to replace the monument, etc. But you argue that in this case, the monuments themselves are equally important and symbolic, and relating to your first question, actually, maybe that helps us loop back through that. And I mean, at the same time, maybe does the city itself is the city itself asking you to make that, in a sense, requiring the historian to kind of actually talk about both, or is it a personal choice as a historian, as a way of looking at it in that particular way?
Mm-hmm. One frustration of people like me, who are trained architects and then they become historians later on in life, is that we were never taken seriously by historians. Despite the fact that it seems to me that historians are making a big mistake by overlooking the 2 elements that you're talking about, the built environment in general, but actually space and buildings as evidence of historical developments or of historical interpretation, of potential historical interpretation. So most of my work is really aimed at writing history through architecture. That's why the title of my book on the Mamluks. I mean, this is how I see my work on the Mamluks. Even though I'm not a truly trained historian in a school of history, but I was trained in what is arguably the best history of architecture program in the country. And I take it very seriously as my mission to actually make this as an established element in any historical investigation, that you look at space and at buildings. Space has actually gained recently. You have a lot of historians who are venturing into the idea of studying space as a historical indus. Buildings are still not really so easy for historians because they still take the study of buildings as a stylistic study of building. If you look at everything that I've produced in the last 30 years, there is not a single stylistic analysis in my writing. I don't give a damn about stylistic analysis. And I don't give a damn about it, not because it can't be used also in the same way, but it's so tedious to do it that way with layers and layers and layers of formalistic analysis to go through in order to be able to come back and say the choice of that style is political, instead of just basically the kind of comparison that you find in a lot of traditional art historical studies that would say that style in here have traces of that other, and you have examples, and somebody would say in the east corner of the church of so and so we find the same leaf decoration that we will find in the mosque of so and so in some other place, and they try to build on that some sort of a deduction. I try to stay away from those. So my analysis almost always is very much influenced by function, which immediately brings in economic and social conditions, and by spatial presence, which immediately bring in the urban dimension. And you'll find the architectural dimension quite weak, really, in my work. And as a matter of fact, I have been critiqued by people as to the weakness of my architectural analysis. And it's really a personal choice, but it's a personal choice that is based on my eagerness to push that argument in a direction of history. So I personally prefer to speak to historian students than to architectural history students. But of course, in the division of labor that we have in this country, I end up speaking a lot more to architects than to non-architects. So there is that desire, if you want, that govern all of my work. And the monuments in the case of Tahrir Square are interesting in one sense, and that is they defined the square, because the square was actually an undefined space at the beginning. It was, to put it actually very truly, it was a leftover space. They just didn't know what to do with it. And for all of its history until now, there had been more than 25 projects at actually designing the square. And I'm on record in an interview with the BBC objecting to the idea of designing Tahrir Square, because that would strip it immediately of the possibility of what I was speaking about, namely that the people would actually define what the space function is. And if you really want to protest, you need a space that is polyvalent, that is malleable, that you can do something with it. If you are going to plant monuments and, I don't know, memorials to the martyrs of the revolution of February 2011 in the middle of Tahrir Square, I mean, there had been few projects. You look at them, ultimately what they are doing, they're dissecting the square so that you can't have 1 million people standing in the square anymore. And to my mind, that was the most beautiful aspect about it, is that this is one space in the middle of a city that allows for 1 million people to stand. We don't have such spaces. I mean, Tiananmen Square, perhaps, the mall in Washington, D.C. I mean, very few spaces around the world would accommodate such a thing. Trocadero in Paris will not allow that, for example. The Bastille is much too small. If you want to storm the Bastille again now, you have to do it with much less than 1 million.
Let me just ask you a very, what I call softball question, something that you could probably answer in 2 minutes rather than 20 minutes, although it may require longer to go into some of the narrative details. So my question is, in response to your answer to Erdal's first question, that in effect architects don't have much agency. They are dependent on their patrons for what they do. And you gave the example of a prison. If you're told to be in prison, you could have architectural agency of building one with light. And for some reason, that reminded me of I.M. Pei and the construction of the Islamic Museum in Doha, where the story that's told, at least that I.M. Pei tells, is that he had free license to do it. And the reason I'm bringing up this anecdote is he claims his own agency, and then he says that the emir told him to go anywhere, and of course he went to Cairo. He went several other places, but he says he was supposed to find the epitome of Islamic architecture. This is a paraphrase, obviously not the full story as he narrates it, but he looked over everything, everywhere, every time period in the Islamic world, and he found himself in Cairo, and he found himself, I think it's the Samanid Mosque,
Ibn Tulun.
Ibn Tulun Mosque, and so that was the replica for him that became the basis for the Islamic Museum. So did he not have agency there? And if he did have agency, was he right in picking the Ibn Tulun Mosque?
He has absolutely no agency. I mean, IMP in here in particular is interesting. And here I can go on record on that. Let me actually put it to you this way. IMP is a consummate modernist. For him to become a historicist requires that he will have to give up his own belief in what architecture ought to be. He was told by the emir, I want an Islamic architecture example. Go and look at history of Islamic architecture. IMP would have designed a museum similar to the new annex to the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. That's IMP. So for him to produce something that is modernist still, but that has this whole story about the way the cube and the circle move together in the ablution fountain in the Mosque of Ibn Tulun, which was built in 1292 by Lajin al-Mansuri, the German Mamluk Sultan that I'm talking about, because he had taken refuge for a year inside Ibn Tulun. Ibn Tulun Mosque was totally deserted and destroyed, and it was a place where prostitutes made their homes. So Lajin Mansuri, who was part of the killing of Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil, the son of Qalawun, and everyone else was decapitated in the citadel. Two escaped, and they were brought back later on and asked for the pardon of the younger brother of al-Ashraf Khalil, who became the greatest sultan of the Mamluk dynasty, and Nasser Muhammad. And he was forgiven, and ultimately he plotted his way back to become a sultan himself for 2 years, and he was killed at the end of which. And he was supposed to have been a very good person. Then he said, supposedly, while he was hiding in that mosque for that year, in around 1991 or thereabout, 1291, I'm sorry, he said that if God releases me of this tragedy in here, I'm going to refurbish the mosque. And then he built this new fountain in the middle, which supposedly drew the attention of IMP. I'm not going to elaborate more because I'm being recorded in here, but I know how IMP came to his form, and it's not agency. It's actually when the patron comes to you and says, I want you to look at Islamic architecture example and be inspired by them. When you are a modernist, you refuse to be inspired by historical architecture. That's relinquishing even the last form of agency. So what does he get in return? He gets a chartered flight that took him from one city in the Islamic world to the other to look at them. He gets an extremely hefty fee. And then he gets the most important thing about him, and this is where the architect is not trying for agency in the sense that you're asking, but he's trying for legacy. He's so correctly that if you build anything in Doha today, chances are it will be destroyed in 20 years because the city is constantly growing. I mean, look at what happened in West Bay in Doha or in any other place that has been overbuilt recently. Whatever existed there had to be removed. So he asked that he will have a piece of land that no one can destroy. And he built the artificial island on which he built this. That's if you want some sort of an agency, but it's not really the agency that you're asking about.
We will finish with your question.
Hi, I'm a student in Dr. McLaren's class, and I was really interested when you were talking about space, and I wanted to know if you could elaborate on just how young people kind of occupied space during the Mamluk period. I'm not sure if that was something that was like really well documented, but I'd love to know how young people occupied space and what it meant politically, intellectually, etc.
When what period, I'm sorry?
Mamluk.
The Mamluk. Well, I mean, we really don't know, so you have to speculate a lot. And what we do usually is we look at some of the very rare painting illustrations of settings and try to imagine how they occupied space. And then we have a little bit of the Orientalist paintings of the 19th century on the assumption that Egypt changed very little between the medieval period and dawn of modernity. So you have a lot of these Orientalist painters traveling to Cairo and depicting the life in Cairo, but also traveling to Istanbul, Damascus, Jerusalem, and so on. But Cairo, I mean, I have done a little bit of research on Orientalist painting, and I would say about 90% of all Orientalist painting are done in Cairo, and the rest are in the rest of the Islamic world. So we have a wealth of information about use of space depicted in paintings that claim to be ethnographically motivated in the 19th century by European painters. If you buy the argument that there is no difference between the 14th and 19th century, which I don't, but if you buy that argument, then you have some indices. Otherwise, we have very little about public life. But there were spaces of protests, and there were spaces of protests that are very similar to the way Tahrir Square or any other square have been used. When you have huge population, Cairo has been one of the most crowded cities in history, in all of its history. It was always overpopulated. And it had very few open spaces. And the open spaces in the Mamluk period were mostly what became famous after the Ukrainian Revolution, the name Maidan, which actually is a Persian word that means open space, hippodrome. And it was initially for hippodrome, for basically practicing polo. Every Mamluk, every Turkic dynasty depended on the prowess of its horsemen, so they always needed to practice polo in order to maintain their equestrian qualities. So you build maidans in every Islamic city, which basically Islamic cities don't have the piazzas of the Italian cities, but they have maidans. And in moments of extreme duress against the people of Cairo, they appropriated the maidans as spaces of protest. So the space that is there for the ruler to show his readiness to fight and the readiness of his own troops to show their military prowess, the same space has been appropriated by people in order to protest the same ruler. And actually there were pitched battles between the Rifraf and the Mamluks in the Maidans. There were 6 Maidans in Cairo, more than anywhere else in the world. Istanbul has 2, for example. Isfahan has 2, and so on. Damascus and Aleppo had 1 each. So there is an appropriation of space that you can read about there, where the space is moving from the place where the ruler displays his ability to rule, or his tools of ruling, the power of his soldiers, to the space where they come in order to protest against decisions by the ruler which they consider to be negative to them.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.